Stand by. Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's meeting, the 25% Set Aside for NSP2 Grantees webinar. Today's conference is being recorded. If you would like to ask a question during today's presentation, you may do so by pressing the star key followed by the digit 1 on your touch-tone phone. If you are using a speakerphone, we do ask that you pick up your handset and ensure your mute function is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the conference over to Ms. Marcia Tonkovich. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the 25% Set Aside. We will talk specifically about NSP2 grantees, but we will also talk about other NSP grantees as well, and we're going to cover some of the requirements as well as some options for how you can meet those requirements. So this is Marcia Tonkovich, and it's good to be with everybody again this afternoon. And I have a couple of co-trainers here with me, so let me introduce Hunter from HUD.
Hi, how are you all doing?
Great, and is David with us?
He just had to step away, but he'll be back in just 1 second.
Okay, great, and so Hunter and David will be here to help also answer questions from HUD. So how's this going to work? If you haven't been on one of these webinars, or if you have, just to recap, we will go through the PowerPoints. We'll see how long they take. We'll try to get through all of them and then take questions, but we may stop in the middle if it starts to go too long. We ask that if you do have a question, that you use your feedback button, which is in the top right-hand corner of your screen, and that you go ahead and turn that feedback button to purple, and that will let us know that there are people waiting to be able to ask questions. That doesn't actually get you in the queue. It just creates a count for us so we know that we have to answer some questions. What we need you to do to get in the queue is to press star 1 on your phone. That will put you in the audio queue, and we'll take those questions in the order that we get them. If someone else has already asked your question and so you no longer need to ask it, you can just press star 2, and that will take you out of the audio queue. You can also use the written-in function for questions if you go up under Q&A, and if you click on that, you can see that you can type in a question, and that will get into the log of questions, and we'll also take those written-in questions in the order that they are received as well. And we hope to be able to get through all these questions in the next couple of hours. So in terms of our agenda, we're going to start with an overview of how the NSP LH25 or Low Income Set Aside rule is implemented, what it covers, what counts, what doesn't count, just so we have a good grounding in how that's being tracked, and we'll give you a sense of what the current status is in terms of the numbers of grantees and where there might be some issue areas. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the programmatic options for how you can meet the set-aside through either home buyer or rental activities. And obviously there's a range of different things that you can do. We'll also take time for questions at the end. And again, we may break in the middle as well, so please feel free to dial in whenever you're ready to ask a question or to write a question in. So let's go ahead and jump in with sort of the very basic question of, and we're going to organize these around the common questions that we have received about the 25% set aside. So the first one that we've heard a little bit from certain grantees is, well, why does it exist and can I get a waiver of it? And the reason it exists is it's part of the statutory intent of all three of the legislation that brought us NSP 1, 2, and 3. Each of them had a set-aside requirement that said that a portion of the funds had to be used, and the key here was to house individuals or families at 50% of AMI and below, who throughout here we're going to call low-income families. And they tied that requirement, the statute tied that requirement, the funding tied that requirement to the expenditure of funds. So it wasn't, unlike the home program or other programs that you might be working in, it wasn't tied to the counts or the numbers of individuals, but rather it was tied to a portion of your funds, in our case 25% of the funds, having to be used to benefit households at 50% of AMI and below. That requirement was included in various forms. It was a little bit different, but it was included within each of the three legislation sources. So NSP 1, NSP 2, and NSP 3 each contain that requirement. So what does that mean? Because it's statutory, there's no opportunity for it to be waived. It's not something that you get close or you're nearby, or you could show that your CDBG program or your home program benefits low-income people. None of that is going to help because it is, in fact, in the statute, and so HUD is required to, therefore, enforce it. And on top of that, it is an important part of the intent of when Congress enacted these funds about who they wanted these funds to at least partially benefit. And so it's not something that I think HUD even would waive. So it's an important aspect of our programs that will be strongly adhered to in terms of compliance. You will hear us talking about this requirement in several different ways. So hear about it called the 25% set-aside or the low-income set-aside. The shorthand version that a lot of us use is LH25, and I'll use that throughout the rest of the presentation. That refers to the way that it is set up in DRGR, the category that's set up in DRGR. They all mean the same thing. They all mean addressing the expenditure requirement for households of less than 50% of AMI. The other thing that's important to know is that because it's in all three sets of legislation, 1, 2, and 3, you have to meet it for each of your sources of funding. So let's say that you do really well on NSP1 and you're at 35% of expenditures, but you do less well on NSP2 and you're only at 18%. That's not going to be acceptable. You can't sort of average it out across the programs. You have to meet the requirement for NSP1, for NSP2, and NSP3, depending on which kinds of funding you have. Each of those has to meet the requirements. David, are you on yet?
He's not.
Okay. I'll come back to him. So the next question is, okay, so given that it is a requirement, it's the way it's going to be, then how is it calculated? And you probably have been receiving reports from HUD that show you where you are and your percentage, and you may be wondering, well, how did they come up with that number? So what happens is there's a threshold that's calculated, so a minimum threshold that you have to meet. And, of course, you can always spend more if you were so inclined toward low-income families. But a minimum threshold is calculated. And then what they're going to do is they're going to look at how much you have expended toward that threshold. So the threshold is calculated as 25% of each individual NSP award plus 25% of the program income on that award. So it's 25% of the grant plus 25% of the program income or 25% of the sum for that particular allocation. So for NSP1, 2, or 3 is the minimum that you have to spend toward LH25. And then what you'll see in the HUD reports is that they will actually show what percentage you have really spent. And so they'll look at your draws, and that's a proxy for expenditures, because there's probably some expenditure information that you haven't yet reported in the DRGR. But they'll use that as a proxy to say how much have you expended toward the 25% set-aside. So are you at 23, are you at 22, or are you at 37? So it'll show what percentage of your grant and what percentage of your program income you have spent toward the 25% set-aside. There also is an obligations where you can show how much you've obligated toward the set-aside, but really what HUD is tracking is the expenditures at this point. Now, the rule about taking 25% of the program income was clarified about a year or so ago for NSP1 and NSP3. There is an outstanding question of whether or not the program income part, the 25% of the program income, applies to NSP2. We know it does to NSP1 and NSP3, and the policy question that's been out there for a little while is whether it does apply because of the way the statute was written for NSP2. We believe that what the lawyers are going to say is that it will apply. It will apply to NSP2. And so what we've been suggesting to people is better safe than sorry, that it would be wise to anticipate that the 25% set-aside requirement will apply to NSP2 program income. And if we know it applies to the NSP2 grant itself, but just be warned that there is still some question about that. And Hunter, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think there's going to be some clarification about that in the closeout notice, it's my understanding. And probably, yeah, so that should be hopefully clarified here in the next little bit.
Okay. So that tells us the threshold, right? We take the 25% and we multiply it by your grant plus your program income to tell us what's the minimum that you have to expend. It doesn't tell us what dollars have to actually be used to meet it. So, for example, you could spend most of your grant money on non-25% set-aside activities if you spend all of your program income on 25% set-aside, so that when you looked at the sum and you looked at the total of your expenditures, it at a minimum met the 25%. So it's not that literally 25% of the dollars that you get back in program income must somehow be held or saved or spent toward an LH25 activity. Rather, what it's saying is in order to calculate that minimum floor, that minimum threshold, we're going to count the program income as part of that calculation, but the dollars that you use to meet it could come out of your grant or could come out of your program income so long as you've met that minimum threshold. So think of it as a numeric minimum that you have to hit. The way you meet the minimum, which dollars are used to meet the minimum, could be a mix and match of your grant and your programming. It is 25% of your funds, so 25% of your expenditures. It's not 25% of the people or 25% of the units you create. We've had some confusion about that, particularly because home does do this differently. And so people have been trying to say 25% of a particular project or 25% of the households that we serve. And while that you might decide to have that as a program requirement on a local level if you want to, you still have to look at the dollars. And so you still have to make sure that 25% of your dollars went to this purpose. If you're trying to figure out what that means, who is a low-income person in my community, there are income limits that HUD publishes. They come out annually, usually around February. I don't know how they were this year. And they're published by household size, so a one-person family, a two-person family, a three-person family. And they are published by jurisdiction. So there'll be a different limit for New York City than there might be for Des Moines. So you need to make sure that as you're looking at which beneficiaries, or which expenditures am I going to count, that you're looking at your appropriate income limits and whether those expenditures that you have done have benefited people at your particular income limit. Now, clarification here that came out in last week's webinar that we did on closeouts and expenditure limits, and just know that this next point is tentative. So if you're following along in the slides, make sure you know that this is pending the closeout notice. But the current interpretation is that the 25% set-aside requirement only applies until we get to closeout. Now, notice I didn't say expenditure, I said closeout. So it applies until your grant is closed out, and that may happen years from now. But when your grant is closed out, then it is no longer, the 25% set-aside no longer applies. So what that means, you're not going to be able to close out your grant until you've drawn down all of your money out of CRGR. So there won't be any grant money left at that point when you get ready to close out. But what you will have after closeout is program income or you might have program income that's coming in after closeout. So what this says is that program income that comes in after closeout will not be subject to the 25% set aside, at least as currently interpreted in the policy. Hunter or David, anything you want to add to that?
Sorry, Marcia. No, we're good.
Okay. So we can, and if folks have questions about that, we can certainly talk through some examples. But here's one just to show you. So the calculation is based upon your entire grant, all your program income, everything you receive before closeout. And one of the questions that I got a couple of weeks ago when I was at a conference was, how does the admin work in this? Because we know that we get to take 10% off the top of both grant money and program income for admin. So is it 25% after admin or 25% before admin? And the answer is it's 25% before admin. So it's 25% of your grant, whatever your grant amount was, plus 25% of your program income, regardless of whatever amount you're spending or allocating to admin, and we know that's capped at 10%. So in this example, they had a $10 million grant, $1 million of program income, and they're spending $1.1 million on admin. The $1.1 million is not applicable to the 25% calculation. We take the $10 million grant, the $1 million program income for $11 million times 25% for 2.75 as that minimum threshold that the grantee could meet. Now, going back to the previous point, just to reiterate, that $2.5 million could be made up of, $2.75 million could be made up of the whole $1 million of program income and then some of the grant. Or the 2.75 could come from entirely out of the grant, and none out of the program income, as long as, in sum, we spend $2.75 million at a minimum on helping folks at 0 to 50% of AMI. So hopefully that makes sense to folks. Again, feel free to write in questions. So then the question becomes, okay, so we know what our minimum is, so we know how it's calculated. What do I get to count toward that set aside? And so there's been some confusion about what kind of costs count and what kind of activities count. And there's actually quite a lot of flexibility in this, and it became more flexible in 2010. So it could be homebuyer or rental projects. There's been some misconceptions that it had to be either or. It could be both. You could have some homebuyer and some rental that you're counting. It's completely up to how you've designed your program. And the activity itself that's being funded, that's creating the low-income housing, could be coming out of activities A, which is financial mechanisms, or B, right, which is acquisition rehab of foreclosed or abandoned property, or E, which is redevelopment. So it could come out of any one of those eligible activities. You'll notice that we don't have listed here land banking or demolition, where it's just demolition by itself. There is no redevelopment associated therewith. So just plain demolition all by itself or land banking will not be able to meet the set-aside requirement. So the rule did change in 2010, as I mentioned, to become more flexible. And what the rule used to say excuse me, was that you had to be a foreclosed or abandoned unit in order to be able to count. The rule was expanded in 2010 to say that activities that are happening under eligible use E, which were vacant units or vacant land, that then were redeveloped into creating units for affordable housing, those units could also count. The units that we create, and this is right out of the statute, have to actually be considered to be housing in order to be able to count them towards the set-aside. So what does that mean? In CDBG, excuse me, there are rules about what's considered to be housing. So things which are facilities, and that could be happening under eligible use E, particularly for NSP1. Facilities are not housing in CDBG. And so because we call certain kinds of developments facilities, we don't get to count the cost of those toward the set-aside. So shelters of any type, any kind of overnight accommodation or short-term accommodation, and group homes, which are common sanitary facilities, common cooking facilities, those sorts of things, where they are typically leased as an entire development or as an entire building, rather than individuals having their own leases. Those kinds of group homes are not considered housing in CDBG. And so while you might be able to do them as an eligible activity under eligible use E, and that cost for an SB1 anyway might be perfectly eligible, you're not going to get to count that cost towards 25% status. Transitional housing may be okay. It depends upon, in your consolidated plan and in your program procedures, how your jurisdiction has designated transitional housing. If you have considered transitional housing to be permanent housing, and that's your uniform policy on that, and that transitional housing has leases and rents and all the things that a normal rental development would have, then you can consider that to be okay and to be considered part of the low-income set-aside. If, however, for the purposes of your CDBG program or for other programs, you have deemed transitional housing to be a facility, then you can't then come back for NSP and call that as housing and count it towards the set-aside. You have to be consistent and say we treat it transitional housing. Finally, it would be okay to do special needs projects. In fact, many grantees have with NSP, and that's perfectly appropriate as a rental project. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a facility if it is operated as rental housing. So it might have services and subsidies and so forth for people with special needs, but it would have a lease with that individual household. It would have a rent charge, an affordable rent charge to that individual household, and it was operated as individual rental, permanent rental, not as a facility. So that's the distinction that we're making. And HUD folks, anything you want to add on that?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. So The question is then, how does it apply to individual activities or individual projects? So people have gotten a little confused about whether it's 25% of every project that I fund, particularly rental projects, or if I have subrecipients, does it have to be 25% of every subrecipient agreement? It doesn't have to be 25% of each deal that you do. The grantee has to track this overall at the end of the expenditure period, or I'm sorry, at the end of the closeout period, for their entire grant. So this is going to be measured in final when we're ready to close out the grant. Have you expended 25% of your resources toward LH25? You could have met that requirement through one big project. So maybe you did a tax credit and NSP deal where a lot of the units were set aside for people at 50% of AMI, and you put a lot of NSP money in that deal. That one single project could have met your set-aside requirement. Or you could say, well, I don't want to do that. I want to have lots of mixed income housing. And so I'm going to spread it across many projects, and that would be okay too. The key is just to look at the dollars and make sure that the sum of all of those 25% expenditures was 25, met that threshold that we talked about. Now, we do have some states and counties and consortia who have lots of partners whom they are funding to do activities, and there are some of those states and counties and consortia who have decided to pass that requirement on to each of their individual partners. So if I'm a state, I have decided that each of the 10 units of local government whom I have funded, each of them has to meet the 25% set aside, so that in sum at the statewide level, we will have met the requirement. And that's okay. Those grantees had the right to decide how to divide up this requirement, whether they were going to meet it in one big project or whether they were going to spread it around or some combination of those things. That was left to each of those grantees. The key thing is that HUD is going to hold that lead entity, that lead the agreement holder, responsible for that compliance across their entire. So regardless of how your grantee has decided to share this, we have to make sure we have compliance at the grantee level. Okay, so we've sort of figured out what our threshold is. We talked about what kinds of projects count. Now we need to look at what kinds of expenditures count. Remember I said that we're going to track this based upon how I spent the money. And as we go through this, and you'll see there's some math that we're going to look at, keep in mind that what we're tracking back to is a relationship between how much NSP money did I spend as a portion of the total development cost for this project, right? So what was my fraction of the cost? And how many units are set aside explicitly and exclusively for persons at 0 to 50% of AMI. Now, the question is, does it matter how I put my money in the project then? So if I put my NSP money up front, let's say, and all I paid for was the land acquisition or the acquisition and the demolition, and then somebody else's money, tax credits or home money or local money, is going to go into the redevelopment. Can I count that? And the answer is yes. It doesn't matter where your NSP money went into the deal. What matters is what portion of the deal did I spend that I paid for, and how many low-income units did I get out the back end? How many have the NSP low-income restrictions? So that means you could pay for not only the hard costs of construction and get to count those costs, but also other things that are associated with the construction, like demolition, where demolition is done as a precursor to redevelopment. So if I go out and I demolish a blighted structure, and I do that for the purposes of then rebuilding on that site new construction of a low-income rental development, I can count those demolition costs as one of the line items in the total development cost. So if I paid for that demolition, and the purpose of that demolition was redevelopment, and that redevelopment generated low-income units, then I can count that expenditure. Now, if I just did demolition, as I said earlier, just standalone demolition, where it's not redeveloped immediately into low-income units, of course, that would not count. Similarly, if I paid for on-site infrastructure on the development site, where it's part of the development budget, part of the total development cost for that project, like on-site landscaping or the on-site sidewalks or street lamps or whatever it might be that are on that site being paid by that developer, part of that project, then I can count those costs as well. Similarly, I can also count project soft costs. So again, if there was an expenditure for things like fees or environmental reviews or legal costs or any of those sorts of soft costs that are part of the total development cost budget. So they're part of the project. They're not allocated, they're not separate, they're not something like that, but they're literally part of this project. Then you can count that expenditure as, again, depending on how many low-income units you get, as part of your LH25. Finally, people have asked this question a lot. You can also count your activity delivery costs if, and only if, you track your activity delivery costs to a specific project address. So if you have documentation that you spend $10,000 of NSP funds on activity delivery costs as part of the development budget for a particular rental project, and you track it to that specific address, then you could count that as part of the total development cost for that project. All right, so let's do an exercise here. So, Vinny, if you want to turn us over to the poll. So the question to the group is, okay, so which one of the following doesn't get to count toward LH25? Down payment assistance to a low-income buyer, rehab costs in a mixed income project where only 10% are low income, cost for a developer fee on an NSP-assisted project, cost to acquire, demolish, and hold in a land bank, or cost for lease purchase where the initial income is 40% of AMI. Good, okay, well, it looks like most people have the right answer here. And the right answer would be the fourth one, the green one, which is the cost to acquire, demolish, and hold in a land bank. And the reason why that wouldn't count is because that land bank is not going to have occupants in those properties that are going to be newly constructed until 10 years from now. And so when you go to close out your NSP grant, you're not going to have occupants in those units because you're not going to build them for another 10 years. And therefore, those costs, the costs associated with that land bank, the acquisition, the demolition, the holding costs, and the disposition costs for that land bank do not count toward LH25 because there is no associated occupancy by a low income. All the others would be okay. The down payment, perfectly fine. Rehab costs and mixed income where we only have a small number of low-income units. The NSP costs that are associated with those low-income units would be okay. So we wouldn't be able to count the other units in that project, but for the 10% of the units that are low-income, we could count those. Developer fees are just in their line item in a development budget, so again, based upon our investment in that project. And the same with lease purchase. So we have it's a form of ownership, and we have a 40% AMI, so that would be acceptable as well. Vinny, why don't we go back over? Okay. All right, so how then do so we figured out now what kinds of costs, what kinds of projects count, and so the question is then, we said we had to count dollars, that we're not counting units, we're not counting households, but what dollars, right? Because in a lot of cases, we're not just funding 100% of the project with NSP. Particularly today, and particularly for rental projects, we're seeing a lot of deals where NSP is part of the investment, but there is also tax credits, there's also home money, there's also other money in there. And so the question is, how do I count those? So the way that we figure that out is we do it based upon what portion of the total development cost that I have paid. In other words, what portion of it is paid by NSP, and what portion of the units are actually designated or set aside for low-income families. So we can take credit for the entire NSP investment that is attributable to units set aside for low-income families, and occupied, I should say, by low-income families. So I will say that when you're going to get tested for this at the back end, when we get to the closeout, it's not enough to say, I designated these units. You will have to show low-income occupancy in the units, in the expenditures on the units that you are counting. So If the units are comparable, in other words, if all the units are the same in the project, and all the one-bedrooms are the same, and all the two-bedrooms are the same, you can do a pretty straightforward mathematical proration to know how much of the NSP investment you can take credit for. If the units are not comparable, so that you can't just do kind of a straight line mathematical analysis, then you'll have to look at how much NSP money did I really put in each of these individual low-income units. So for now, for purposes of simplicity, we're going to assume that they're comparable so we can kind of show what that simple mathematical proration might look like. So this is, again, assuming that we don't have just NSP funds in this project, and we do not have an entire project where everybody is 50% of AMI and below. This is assuming we have a mixed income project where some of the units are set aside and are occupied by low-income households, and some of the money is paid by NSP. I will say that if the project is entirely benefiting people at 0 to 50% of AMI, then you can count your entire NSP investment, because obviously that's the entirety of the people who are living. So if it's a mixed income project with mixed financing sources, we're going to do this sort of mathematical proration to see how much money we get to count for the 25% set aside. So what we're going to do is we are going to look at the total development cost of the project, right? So that's the total. It's not the total NSP cost. That's the total cost of the project, including hard and soft construction costs. It would include the developer fee. It would include other, the soft costs. Might include activity delivery if you have tracked it through this particular project. And then we're going to look at, okay, how much NSP money did I put in that deal? So what is the total amount of NSP investment in the overall $10 million in my example here of total development costs? So we have $2 million of the $10 million has been paid by NSP. Presumably that other $8 million has come from tax credits or home or some other resource. If there's 100 units in this project, and again, for the purposes of simplicity here, we're going to assume they're comparable, and we've agreed with the property owner that 30 of the 100 units will be occupied by households at less than 50%, equal to or less than 50% AMI. So there's an agreement with that owner that says, for the affordability period, 30 of the 100 units will be used or housed for persons at 0 to 50% of AMI. And in fact, we will document that first tenant who moves into those units as having that income threshold. In this example, we can take credit for our entire $2 million of investment, because if you look at how much money we put into the deal, we put in 20% of the money, right? So $2 million over $10 million, we paid for 20% of the total development cost with NSP funds. But because of our good negotiating skills, we actually got 30 units or 30% of the units as set aside and occupied by low-income households following the NSP affordability period and all of that. So we've got an agreement that quantifies this. But we got far more than what we put in. We got 30% of the units, but we only paid 20% of the cost. So in that case, we can take credit for the entire $2 million. We don't have to somehow chop it up and call part of the $2 million for LMMH, Vermont Housing, instead of LH25. We can take credit for the entire $2 million. Now let's make it a little more complicated. We have an example here where instead of just having very low income and other kinds of units, we're now going to have two different types of units. We're going to have units that are at 0 to 50, and then we're going to have some units that are at 51 to 120. And both of those are considered to be, in this example, NSP units. So they're following the affordability period. They've got all the rules, the rent restrictions, and so forth during the affordability period. So we have, in this example, $5 million total development cost, of which 1.25 has been paid by NSP. 50 units in the project, of which 30 are set aside for NSP. 10 are at 0 to 50, and 20 are at 51 to 120. The LH25 units, right, are 20% of the total, 10 of the 50, and the other units, of course, are more. But the NSP investment was 25% of the total, right? We put in 1.25 of the $5 million in this deal. So what that says is that I funded both the low-income units and I funded the moderate or middle-income units, or some of them as well. So how do I count my credit? How do I get my credit in DRGR? So we're going to look at what percentage of the total investment did I put in? And so I put in 25% of the total. We're going to look at what percentage of the units were actually 25% set aside, in this case, 20% of the units. And so I can count $1 million of my NSP investment because I can attribute that as having benefited those 10 very low-income units or low-income units. And the balance, the $250,000, is still eligible because it benefited households to 51 to 120, but I don't get to count it toward the 25% set aside. So you can see from this calculation that what I'm really doing is looking at how many units did they agree to set aside in writing for the affordability period, following the rules, for people at 0 to 50, occupied by people at that income level, as compared to what percentage of the development costs that I pay for. So we have a little example, and then I think maybe we'll take a quick break and get some questions. So the exercise, and we'll give you some background, and then we'll let you guys calculate the answer. So assume that I had $5 million of total development costs, and I only put in $200,000 of NSP. So I just acquired the land. That was my entire contribution to this project. There are 100 units in the project, of which 50 are designated as NSP units in general. So 50 are following the NSP rules. And of those 50 NSP units, 30 are set aside to be low income. So we have $5 million project, only $200,000 of NSP in this deal. Presumably other funds are in there. As I said, tax credits, bonds, home, whatever else is in there, CDBG. And of those units, we're going to have 50 are affordable, and 30 of them are set aside for very low income, 30 of the 50. So let's figure out what amount of this $200,000 do I get to count towards the 25% set aside. So, Vinny, I think we can go to the next slide. So, of that calculation, what do you think? How much do we get to count toward the 25% set aside? Give it a moment here for people to vote. Great. Okay, looks like folks got the right answer. So the right answer here is $200,000. And the reason why I get to count the entire, Vinny, let's go back over to the slide. The reason why I get to count the entire $200,000 is because of the percentage of the investment that I paid for, the total development cost. So if you look at the total development cost, $5 million, we paid $200,000 of the $5 million, or 4%. But we got 30% of the units as low-income set-aside units, 30 of the 100. And so that's 30%. So even though I only put in 4% of the money, I got 30% of the unit. So I get to count all $200,000. I don't have to somehow prorate the $200,000 between the LH25 units and the other moderate or middle income NSP unit. I can take entire credit for this $200,000. And the reason why this was possible in this example, by the way, was because they had other sources in there. They had tax credits or whatever it is, which enabled us to have more affordable units than our $200,000 of investment would have normally bought. And this will often happen. Something like this will happen when you have another program that has its own affordability restrictions in it. So, for example, the tax credit program has a requirement that a certain percentage of the units be set aside for people either at 50 or 60% of AMI. And so when you combine with tax credits, you're going to be able to get more NSP units than you would otherwise have because they have essentially the same rules. You just need to make sure it follows the NSP affordability period. Okay, so maybe we'll stop and take a couple of questions, Hunter, or should we keep going on the slides?
Go for it.
Okay, so I'll take a couple of questions. So first I'm going to go to the phone line. So Andrea, do we have folks set up on the phone?
Currently we do not have any questions on the phone line, but once again, ladies and gentlemen, that is *1.
Okay, terrific. Let me look and see if we have written in questions, and if not, we will keep going. Okay, so Steve has a question. Okay, so Steve has a good question. Steve's question is, what if the $10 million in the mixed income project contains, say, 15% of the TDC is commercial? Does the percentage of LH25 go against the total $10 million? So I think the question to David and Hunter is, if the TDC is inclusive of what would in essence be ineligible items, because commercial is not eligible under NSP. In this case, the example that Steve's raising is 15% of it was commercial. Do we apply the percentage to the total, or do we only apply it to the eligible portion of the development cost? And I would argue it's only the eligible portion. I would take out the commercial from the TDC before I calculate it. What do you guys think?
Yeah. You take a proration approach.
Exactly. So guys, you would subtract the part of the TDC that is applicable to the commercial, because that's not eligible. You can't pay for that with NSP. And then you would look at your percentages. Do you agree, David?
Yep.
Okay. So hopefully that answers the question. I think that was, and I think the second question was the same. So I think we've covered that. So again, guys, please feel free to press *1 on your phone to ask questions or get into the queue with the written in. So I think I'll go back and I'll keep going through the slides, and then we'll take another batch of questions at the end. So the next thing is, okay, so how do I tell people, the public and HUD, and take credit for my expenditures? And that is done via DRGR. So when you set up a project in DRGR and it's going to have some or all of the units benefiting people at 0 to 50% of AMI, you're going to set it up under the LH25 category. That's why we call it this. And you have a separate category for LH25 from LMMI, or low, mod, middle income, which is all the other expenditures that you're doing. And so you're going to set up an activity and track those expenditures under LH25 when you know up front that that is, in fact, who the beneficiaries are going to be. And you might have to prorate a project, the example we had before, where you had some of the expenditure going to LH25 and some of the expenditure going to LMMI. You might have to do that in some of your projects as well. Then you're going to back that up by your QPR, where in the QPR you're going to describe the beneficiaries and the activities that you have undertaken. And in your files, you're going to document that income documentation that I talked about earlier. You're going to have the proof. If you said we had 100 units set aside for LH25, you're going to have that income verification and the backup in your files to prove that those occupants were, in fact, 0 to 50% of AMI. So you'll put that, you'll set it up in DRGR, you'll report against it in DRGR, and then you'll have the backup documentation in your local file. There are some reports in DRGR that will tell you how you're doing on your 25% set aside, and there also are some approximate reports that are on the Resource Exchange. I will say that they're a little bit dated. You can find them in the snapshots, for example. But they go back to the end of the year. They're done quarterly. So you really want to pull your DRGR data to get the most accurate current numbers on where you stand on LH25. I did get a question from a colleague earlier about what if I set up the project initially as, let's say, a non-LH25, I set it up under LMMI, and then the purchaser happens to be 0 to 50%, so I want to take credit. I want to make sure that I get credit for that occupant, and I change it. Yes. So if you set it up originally as LMMI, and then you go back and you look at the occupant, and it turns out that, in fact, the person who actually buys this project or actually rents this unit, and for rental, you'd have to make sure it's actually set aside for the affordability period for that low-income population. Then you can go ahead and change your designation in DRGR and reset it up, and there is a way to do it. And you may actually have to move data and move information around. And if you are in that situation, you can actually go to the help desk, whether it's the DRGR help desk or writing it into the Ask a Question, and folks can help you to make that switch in here. Okay, so the timing of when it is counted. So as I mentioned earlier, HUD is going to calculate the long-income set-aside when we get to the closeout. So what will happen at the expenditure deadline, and the expenditure deadline is different than the closeout. The expenditure deadline is what's going to hit us next winter, February or March of next winter, for NSP1 and NSP2, and the 50% deadline for NSP3 at that point, and then the 100% deadline for NSP3 a year later than that. And the expenditure deadline, they're going to check it. They're going to say, okay, how are you doing on the 25% set aside? Are you way behind? Are you generally doing okay? And if you're way behind, you're probably going to get some outreach, whether it's for TA or from your field office. But the absolute compliance deadline for this, where they're really going to check, is at closeout. And when we get to closeout, you've spent all of your money, you have met the goals that you set out in your action plan, you have occupied your units, and now we're ready to close out And that will happen at some point after the expenditure deadline, maybe a matter of months, maybe a matter of a year or 2 years, depending on your program. But when you're ready to close out, HUD is going to look to see whether or not you have met the 25% set aside at the time of closeout. So it is possible that you'll get to the expenditure deadlines a year from now, and you will have spent your money, but you have not yet leased up or sold your units. That will be okay, as long as when you get to the closeout and when you are ready to close out your project, you have actually got those units occupied by low-income people, and you can show that the expenditure benefited those low-income folks. So closeout is going to be your key date, but you will be tracked at the expenditure deadline to see how you're doing on progress. Now remember that the compliance, they are going to go back in when HUD goes to monitor or the IG comes out to monitor. It's not enough just to say, I built these units and they're set aside for low-income folks. You actually do have to show who the occupants were, and you have to have the income documentation to back up that not only did you intend to spend this money or did you spend this money on units that were designated for low income, but you actually had that occupancy. And as I mentioned earlier, you're not allowed to count units in a land bank because they're not yet occupied. Okay, so what happens if we don't get there? So we get, all of our money is drawn down, and we're ready to close out, and we don't get to this, we've missed. We haven't gotten to the 25% set aside. This will be a significant issue, and I think I'll let David and Hunter jump in here, but HUD is taking this requirement quite seriously because it is, as I said, a statutory requirement. So HUD will require one of several things to occur. One is that you'll have to repay the funds that you actually did spend, or HUD might make you dip into your own pocket to make up the gap that you didn't meet on the 25% set aside, or HUD could actually say that you're in violation of your grant agreement and make you pay back all of your NSP funds, not just the portion you didn't meet on the 25% set aside. So depending on the gravity of the situation, any one of those remedies are possible. So it's a quite serious issue. You will probably also get monitoring findings from the Inspector General and so forth if you miss this. So you want to be tracking this and being careful about meeting. And of course, as I mentioned, they won't let you close out until you do. David or Hunter, anything you want to add to sort of HUD's current thinking about this?
Yeah, just that, the 25% set-aside requirement comes to us from the statute, and we don't really have a lot of wiggle room with it. So we just can't stress enough the importance of carrying it out. Right? Now, it's expected that some of those units may take more time to be completed, but if whatever the program is that you're using to achieve the set-aside is not working, then please switch gears. I know a number of our grantees weren't interested in rental housing, so they were trying to do for-sale units, but the subsidies that they had to provide were so steep that it was challenging, right? So if you find yourself in that situation, please regroup. But just make sure that whatever you're doing is helping you get to this set-aside requirement and not avoid it.
Yeah, it really. We just want to stress it, and that's sort of why we're having this conversation now, so there's enough time to consider redesigning your program if you're one of those grantees who's having trouble, and we'll look at some data later about where we stand. So with that, let's go to the next poll, Vinny. So take a guess, guys, at how much has been spent so far, nationwide to date, on LH25 activities across the sum of all three grants. So across the combination of all three grants, how much would you guess has been spent on low-income set-aside activities so far? We'll give it just a moment. And we know that folks don't have this data, so this is just meant to give you guys some nationwide perspective. All right, so surprisingly, and I think great, the answer is actually about $1.5 billion so far. And Vinny, let's go back to the slides. So approximately $1.5 billion has been spent, $1.55 billion for LH25 to date across all three. So that's a sum of NSP 1, 2, and 3. And there are a good number of grantees, 24 of them, who actually have dedicated and spent more than 50% of their money on low-income set-aside. And these, of course, have tended to be grantees who have either done a lot of rental housing, or there have been some grantees who have done some special kinds of home ownership programs, whether through their habitats or through other nonprofit partners. They're doing targeted kinds of home ownership programs. So there are a number of grantees who are really focusing this money on low-income set-aside. On the other hand, however, there are a large bucket of grantees who are quite behind so far. So there's 48 of the NSP1 grantees who are currently at less than 25% as a portion of their total draws to date. And I will tell you that of those 48, I think there are a number of those 48, a large number of those 48, who are actually at less than 15%. So it's not like they're right at the 25. So if you're one of those grantees, now is the time to begin thinking about redesign, because you're getting close to the end here. There are 11 of the NSP2 and 15 of the NSP3, but because the way HUD calculates the 25% set-aside, what they look at is the portion of the money that you have drawn so far as compared to the portion of money that you have spent on the LH25. And so that NSP3 number is skewed a little bit because there's 170 grantees in NSP3 who have spent zero or a very small amount of their NSP3 funds. So because they haven't spent any funds, they by definition haven't spent a lot of LH25 funds. So there's actually a lot more NSP3 grantees who have an issue as well. There's a number of grantees who are in the boat of needing to think about program design. And it really is important to get a handle on where you are and have a good tracking on whether or not you're going to be able to get there, and if not, how might you want to regroup. So what are some options? So we've now kind of gone through the requirements and how it has to work. Let's jump into thinking about, okay, so given that we understand what we have to do, and maybe you are one of those grantees who's in the boat of, okay, I have to do some redesign, what are the many paths? And there are lots of choices. So this is meant to be that menu. Not all of these are going to work for your market. So obviously before we jump into this and think about redesigning your program, the first thing to do is to look at your market and look at what kind of demand you realistically have among your home buyers and among your tenants, and really what's needed in your community. So the first option, and the one that many people are using to meet the 25% set-aside, is simply to construct or acquire and rehabilitate and then lease multifamily rental projects. So you could envision any size. It could be a small multifamily. It could be a very large multifamily project where NSP is paying a part or all of the construction costs or of the acquisition rehab costs to develop that multifamily housing. So as I mentioned earlier, there are grantees who are doing several very large projects, and those very large projects entirely meet their requirements, and in many cases more than their requirements. So it could be mixed income, where we have some of the units that are set aside for middle and moderate income, and some which are LH25. Or there are some grantees who have done projects that are 100% set aside, where every unit in the project is set aside for very low-income households. And again, that might be some of those tax credit projects where there's a concurrent requirement from that program. It has been particularly effective to combine tax credits and NSP together, a big resource for development of affordable rental housing. And as I mentioned earlier, there are tax credit requirements that your tax credit units have to be either at 50 or 60% of AMI, depending on how you're funded by your state. And so it's a natural match to take your NSP money, combine it in a tax credit project, and take credit for those units that are set aside under the tax credit program for households at 0 to 50%. Now, you wouldn't get to count the units at 0 to 60, but you could count the 0 to 50 units, and obviously you would have to designate those as NSP units for the NSP affordability period. But in many cases, the tax credit compliance period is equal to or longer than the NSP period. You want to check that. Now, that's the positive of it. The negative of it, and this has been true for a number of grantees, is that is dependent upon the state allocating tax credits to that project. And depending on where you are in your state's cycle of the allocation of credits, you may not have time to have your project get into the application queue, get awarded credits from the state, and then get into development in time to get them constructed, get them occupied, and count them for NSP. So if you're looking to combine NSP and tax credits as a way of meeting the set-aside, you might want to look at projects that are already underway, where a developer is looking for gap financing, and where you might be able to fill that gap, again, assuming the units qualify, that the project qualifies for NSP. So you might take a look at that. If there are new projects that are going to be tax credits, again, you want to talk to the state and make sure that you can make the timing work. There are also existing tax credit projects that are in some communities that actually have been foreclosed, and where NSP could come in with acquisition rehab and help preserve that project. So if you want to try this, those of us who've worked at tax credits for a long time, there are some very complicated rules that would overlay with NSP. It can be a terrific resource to combine, but it's very important to understand those tax credit rules and make sure you've complied with both tax credits and NSP concurrently. So you probably want to seek the counsel of an attorney or a tax counsel, or at least other grantees who have done this, or your state housing finance agency. Another option is to do rental, but instead of doing multifamily, do scattered sites. So you may have some existing rental projects, or existing, for that matter, projects you intended to have be home ownership, where instead of being in a large multifamily building, there's a series of scattered site units. And the idea is, instead of doing those as ownership, go ahead and do those as scattered site rental, and then lease those units to very low-income households, again with a restriction for continuing that throughout the affordability period. That might be a way of addressing some of the grantees who have owner units that they've been unable to sell, or to sell for home ownership, turn those into rental, and similarly get credit for LH25. So that's probably an example of where you may have originally set it up under LMMI, intending to sell it to whatever income home buyer, and then now that you can't sell it, you want to go ahead and update your data in DRGR, turn it into an LH25 project with a focus on rental housing. Now, if you do want to do this, if you want to do the scattered site rental housing, you want to make sure you do get some help on the property management, because obviously managing scattered site projects has its own complexities in terms of the cost of doing that and the feasibility of maintenance and things like that. So many grantees who have tried this scattered site rental housing have done it in partnership with their housing authorities or other nonprofit organizations who are experienced in doing scattered site rental. The next option is to do rental housing, but consider doing special needs housing. And as I mentioned, we can't do group homes, can't do shelters, but we can do permanent rental housing for persons with special needs. And you could work with your nonprofit organizations or other organizations within your community to develop those units, and you might even look at some of your home chodos who have done this kind of activities before. It could be multifamily, so you could have a large multifamily development, and you could have some of those units be set aside for persons with special needs, and again, you'd want to make sure they set aside persons at 0 to 50%. Or you could turn some of those scattered site units into accessible units for persons with special needs. So again, as long as you've got that income cap at 50%, you could count some of those towards your LH25. Now, it's important to note that these kinds of projects usually require some sort of operating subsidy, and that's because typically it is the case that the income that comes in, the rental income that comes in on special needs projects, or for that matter, if you did a 100% project with 100% LH25 units, 100% very low income units, even if you put a deep NSP subsidy in that deal, so that there's not a lot of expense in terms of debt service for the property owner, typically these kinds of projects do have fairly high operating expenses, and the rent that comes off of what a person at 0 to 50% can afford is often not enough to pay those operating expenses. So if you want to invest in one of these kinds of deals, you want to be thinking about operating subsidies to help pay those ongoing operating costs. NSP cannot be the source of that. So you can't use NSP as an ongoing operating subsidy. You can use it, David, I believe you guys have clarified that it can be used up front as part of the development cost for sort of that initial period, but it cannot be used as an ongoing subsidy. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah. So if you want to do these kinds of deals, particularly the special needs deals, you want to look to your housing authority. Perhaps there is some Section 8 money. You want to look to foundations. You want to look to other kinds of sources for paying for that ongoing operating subsidy. Finally, one that's...
Marsha?
Oh, yes.
I just want to real quick, but I just want to point out that we're also going to be having a webinar on June 7th dealing with NSP and supportive housing. So that might be something that folks who are thinking about that might want to check out.
Oh, thank you, Hunter. That's great. Yeah, because there's obviously a lot more to it than we can cover here. The next one that we've heard from folks that people haven't been thinking of, but I think is really an opportunity under NSP that we haven't seen most people take advantage of. And that is that under eligible use E, which, as I said earlier, is now eligible for LH25, is now eligible for the set-aside, you can take vacant, abandoned, obsolete, old buildings, and they don't currently have to be housing, and you can rehab those old buildings, redevelop them, turn them into affordable rental housing, again, for people at 0 to 50, and count those expenditures toward the LH25 set-aside. So the benefit of doing something like this is you get to repurpose one of those old abandoned buildings in your community, so you get that benefit from it. And because you're turning it into affordable housing or perhaps mixed income where you're going to take your share of the percentage, you get to count it towards the 25% set-aside. So this was not originally possible when we started this program because we couldn't use eligible use E. But now that we can, these kinds of redevelopment activities where you're reusing some sort of abandoned old building, really, or vacant old building, really can be a win-win for the community. So if you're stuck and you're trying to get to your 25% set-aside and you have something like this in your community, and it's in one of your target neighborhoods, of course, this might be something to look at. Now, we can also do homeownership activities for the 25% set-aside. So we don't mean to say it just has to be rental. And one of those opportunities is to do lease purchase so that we could take those scattered site units that we talked about earlier, and we could do lease to purchase, where we treat them as a rental for a specific period of time, with the idea being that they're going to transition into being a permanent affordable homeownership unit at that end point when the tenant goes to buy it. And there's no specific period. It could be 2 years later, it could be 3 years later, depending on your program design, where the rental turns into an ownership unit. NSP would count here because you could use NSP funds to acquire, rehabilitate, or construct these units, and then you've got the NSP expenditure. And you would look at the income of that tenant who is in that lease purchase program, and assuming that that tenant is in fact low income, very low, 0 to 50, you could count that household towards your 25, and that expenditure towards your 25% set aside. Now, the good news on lease purchase is that this is determined. You figure out this eligibility for lease purchase when the household initially occupies the unit. You can count that unit and count that expenditure when you've done that initial income verification and the person actually moved in. You are not required, when it comes time 2 years from now, to go back and actually transfer title and sell it to them. Again, assuming it's the same tenant who has stayed in place and is now going to become the owner, you don't have to re-income verify them. They are already eligible to buy. So you've already counted them. Now, you do want to have a plan for what happens if 2 years from now they're not able to buy. You want to have a plan for how are you going to continue that then as a rental. Okay, you can also develop homebuyer units and then sell those homebuyer units to low-income households. So you can use NSP funds for acquisition, demolition, reconstruction, or new construction, or for acquisition rehab, and the idea is that then it's sold to a low-income buyer. There are a lot of concerns. People have raised a lot of concerns about that model, having to do with what those low-income buyers can afford over the affordability period and over the life of the unit. In other words, while I might be able to afford the upfront mortgage or the closing cost, can I, as a low-income buyer, afford the maintenance and the insurance and the taxes that are going to come on that unit down the road? So even though you might have a deep subsidy where I can afford that mortgage. Can I afford to live there? And so you want to think about this model. If you're going to use this model as the way to meet it, then make sure you're not putting the home buyer in a situation where they're not going to be able to afford the house 5 years from now and they're going to have to move or to sell it. So think about having a deep subsidy, and we'll share some examples of that in just a moment. Think about how you price it and how much you make them pay so they have enough money left in their pocket to be able to pay for those ongoing expenditures. And we're recommending that you consider seeking out partners in a process like this who have long-standing and successful models for how to do low-income home ownership. So Habitat, of course, has done this across the country, as has some of the NeighborWorks affiliates. There are many other CHOTOs and other nonprofits across the country who have done this. So you might want to consider partnering with them because they've developed a way of integrating the counseling and the other kinds of assistance into that home buyer process. The other way to do home ownership for the 25% set-aside is direct buyer assistance. So this is where, instead of developing and selling the units, you are now providing a mortgage or down payment assistance or closing cost assistance or a soft second or whatever it might be for an individual household who goes out and purchases an abandoned or a foreclosed or a vacant. And you are subsidizing that home buyer rather than the development of the unit. And in many cases, we see that kind of subsidy combined with an FHA mortgage because it's often the only kind of mortgage that low-income households can receive. The difficulty with this model is that it will be very hard for many of these home buyers to qualify for a private mortgage at that income level and given underwriting criteria from private lenders. So going this way is your model for your program. You just have to go into it with eyes open about what that implies for the underwriting, what that implies in terms of the level of subsidy that you have to put in there in order to make it affordable to that buyer and to make enough people able to meet the requirements so they can actually buy a house. And you need to consider how to build in the counseling so that you have this sort of safety net of people being able to continue to maintain and live in those houses. So it can be done. Many grantees have struggled with this model. So it will depend upon your market. It will depend upon what kind of subsidies you're putting in the unit as to whether you'll be able to get enough low-income home buyers or very low-income home buyers who you'll be able to count for the 25% set-aside. So we talked about this a great deal at some of the clinics that have been happening across the country, and there's been some confusion about how to make this work for these very low-income home buyers, particularly when we're seeing across the country the difficulty of these home buyers in getting private mortgages. Even FHA mortgages have been an issue in some places. So if we want to be able to go the home buyer route, and we want to be able to subsidize the home buyer, whether it's through the direct development and then sale or whether it's through the direct home buyer subsidy, we have to think very carefully about what price we sell the unit for, and similarly, how much subsidy we put in the deal. And what we've been hearing from folks is that there's a trade-off in this analysis between the sale price of the home and the market around it. And home buyers, a low-income home buyer, might only be able to afford half of the value of the property or three-quarters of the value of the property. And yet on the other side of this equation, the grantee does not want to further depress the values in the neighborhood. And so the answer to that then is to go ahead and sell the house if you're doing development or if you're working on a home buyer subsidy deal. Have the sale price of the home be the market value of that home, but then use NSP funds to write down a very deep subsidy, a very deep soft second loan, which can be deferred, forgivable, payable upon sale, any kind of a soft mechanism that the home buyer doesn't actually have to pay until they go to sell the house down the road. And there is no cap on how big that soft second loan can be, other than, of course, cost reasonableness. So they could have a very small first mortgage and a very large soft second from you, and the combination of those two sources of financing enable the home buyer to buy the home and to afford the home and keep the sale price at the current market value. I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. You can also provide down payment and closing cost subsidy, but don't forget that the down payment assistance is capped at half of what's required, so you can't pay more than half of the required down payment. But I just talked about soft seconds. Soft seconds are not capped. So if you're trying to provide a deep subsidy to this low-income home buyer, you can provide half the down payment and also provide a deep soft second or closing costs in addition. You can act as a first mortgage lender if you want to under NSP. There are servicing issues with that. You'd have to be able to service that loan. But that might be another way of helping low-income buyers when they can't get a private mortgage. And finally, there are some communities, I know particularly in Phoenix, where they're using land trusts. And what happens under a land trust is that a nonprofit owns the land that the units are sitting on, so that breaks down the cost. It makes it cheaper for the buyer. And then the buyer has a long-term lease, a long-term land lease on that lot, and they own the physical structure. And so that helps to write down the cost because obviously they're only paying for the physical structure, and it helps to ensure that it remains affordable over a longer period of time. So here's some examples of how the numbers might work if you're going to try to do this with a very low-income buyer. So in my example here, we have $200,000 of a total development cost. The value is only worth $150 at the end of the day. But this is a very low-income buyer, and they can only afford $50,000 as a mortgage. We don't want to depress the market by selling the unit to them at $50. We don't want our HUD 1 to show the sale price of $50. What we do is we sell it to them at $150, and we have NSP as a deep soft second. So the sale price on the HUD 1 would show at $150, which is the value. And again, notice that the development cost is greater than the value. The buyer has $1,000 that they put down. Could be more, could be less, but the purpose of the calculation. And they get what they can afford on a first mortgage from a private lender, which is $50. We at NSP provide the balance, which is $99,000. So what we're going to have on this house is a $50,000 first mortgage and a $99,000 NSP soft second mortgage. And that NSP soft second mortgage could be forgivable, only payable upon sale, reduced over time, and we have lots of flexibility about what happens to that $99,000. We, the NSP program, are going to get back $51,000 in program income at the time of closing. We get the $1,000 from the buyer and the $50,000 from the private lender that will come back into the program. The balance staying in. That's how that would work. Now, what if we actually wanted to be the first mortgage lender? Because maybe we have a situation where we have a low-income buyer who can afford $80,000 of a mortgage, but they have no credit history or maybe a bad credit history, and they can't get a private loan. And so in that case, we still sell it at $150 because we still don't want to depress the market values. And let's say they have $3,000 to put down. But now we're going to have two NSP mortgages on this house. We're going to have an NSP first, which is what they can afford, the $80,000, and that's going to be amortizing, and they'll pay us back at whatever interest rate we set. It's 0% or 1%, whatever it is. And we're going to have a $67,000 deferred forgivable soft second mortgage, $67,000, that doesn't get amortized. And so they're only paying on the $80,000 that they can afford, but we're still selling the house at $150,000. We, the NSP program, in this example, when we go to the closing table, are only going to get the $3,000 back from their down payment. Everything else will be tied up in the unit, and from the amortizing mortgage, from the $80,000, we will get periodic payments, which will come back to the NSP grantee, and those periodic payments with the interest will be programming. So we'll get that back over time. So you'll see that there's a lot of ways that we can make homeownership work for very low-income households by thinking about a deep subsidy without having a negative impact on the market. So let's get some feedback from the folks who are on the phone, and then we do have some questions backed up. So which of the NSP approaches has been working best for you? So which one has been working best for LH25? And we'll give it a moment for people to vote. Okay, so it looks like most folks are meeting their 25% set aside through some rental activity, whether we have new construction, acquisition rehab, scattered site rental. It looks like the majority of us are meeting the 25% set aside through rental, with a smaller number of folks doing direct home ownership assistance or development and sale of home buyer units. So, again, for those of you who haven't tried rental housing, who had hoped to do home ownership, it might be worthy of a look to see if there's a way that might perhaps work better for you if the home ownership is problematic. Hey, Vinny, let's go back to the slides. All right, so if you're having, to wrap this up and then we'll take some questions, if you're having a hard time meeting this set aside, what should you do now? What could you do now? So first of all, you want to look at your market and you want to say, okay, what's going on? Why can't I meet the set aside? What's happening with it? And we've talked to some grantees where they really wanted to do home ownership. Their policy, their political determination was, we really want home ownership. But there simply isn't enough demand in that marketplace, whether it's from low-income buyers or other buyers. And so they're not meeting the 25% set-aside because there simply are not any low-income buyers to buy. So in that case, there's a mismatch of the market and their program intent. So now is the time to come back and take another look at the way you designed your program and say, look, maybe what our market really demands here is rental housing. That we have low vacancy rates in our rental housing. We have demand for rental housing. If we're going to meet this 25% set aside, perhaps now we need to change. Or perhaps the issue in your market isn't that there's not demand for low-income home ownership, but that there needs to be that deep subsidy. And so perhaps there are some NSP grantees who set up caps on how much NSP assistance they would provide. No more than $50,000 per household, no more than $30,000 per household. And that may be the limitation. So you want to go back and take a look at what people can afford within your market and whether you need to go back and change your program design to address that reality. That also then relates to household demographics in terms of whether it's tenants or whether it's owners, what can our households afford to pay at 0 to 50%? And are we appropriately setting the subsidy to enable to help those folks? And what kind of housing stock do we have? Do we have a lot of existing rental housing that's very vacant? In which case, perhaps we do need to do home ownership. Or do we have a very high vacancy rate in our home ownership units, and rental is where the demand is? So we need to take a look at that and take a realistic look at how the LH25 plays in with that. Also take a look at who else might be able to help us with experience in serving people at 0 to 50. Your housing authorities are a good partner in that. Many housing authorities have a lot of experience, particularly through their voucher programs, of serving that population, and they may even have waiting lists that you could use, you could partner with. Similarly, other nonprofits like Chodos or NeighborWorks or Habitat or CDCs within your community. And then finally, look to see if there's other programs where you could leverage your NSP funds where they already have a process for doing 25% set-aside units, for doing low-income units. And as I mentioned earlier, the tax credit program, but there also could be the home program, there could be bond deals, there could be Hope 6, and I will give you a heads up, you need to make sure the resale recapture provisions work there, but could work. So you want to look at, are there other existing projects already happening which will qualify for NSP because of the types of units they're dealing with, where I can use NSP as an additional source of gap. So bottom line here, many choices for how to address your program and doing an analysis to kind of figure out what's not working, if indeed it's not for you, and then trying to make that change now. Don't wait until we get close to the expenditure deadline, because by then you will be perhaps too far through your money to be able to make this work. So now is the time to go ahead and rethink if it's not working. So with that, I think we are ready to take some questions. So Andrea, do we have folks on the phone?
We do have a participant on the phone line, but before we go to that caller, I would like to remind everyone once again that is *1. We'll take our first question from John.
Hi, John.
Hi. You've talked throughout the session about needing the backup documentation for the income of the buyers to track your expenditures for your LH units. So I set up my project for LH, and I constructed, and I finish it off, but I just can't sell the last 5% or rent the last 5% of the units. Was there some kind of implication that you weren't supposed to record those expenditures or draws against that LH category until those units were rented?
No, you can count the expenditure in DRGR toward the LH category, but you're not actually going to have been deemed to have met it until, as I said, at closeout. And at closeout, you have to actually have the national objective information in there. And you can't enter the national objective information until you actually have an occupant. So what's going to happen is, while HUD is going to track the dollars, at the expenditure deadlines that are coming up, when they get to the closeout, they're actually going to look at not only expenditures, but actually the national objective data, and that's where you're going to have the problem. So hopefully that grantee will have enough time between now and when they get through to the closeout to go ahead and get those rented or sold for sale to a low-income household. If that doesn't begin to be true, and we get to the end and we're at the closeout period, and those units have been rented to somebody else, and they've been rented to a non-low-income person, or a non-50% of income person, or maybe they're still vacant, then I think there probably would be a truing up in DRGR, where you would probably have to take the portion of your expenditure that you counted that isn't going to get to count because it's not actually occupied by a low-income person and clean that up. But for now, the key is to get it done by closeout. Does that make sense, John?
Yep.
And would you add anything to that, David or Hunter?
No, that's pretty much it.
Okay. All right, great. Anything else, John?
Nope.
Okay, great. Anything else, Andrea, on the phone?
There are no further questions on the phone line at this time.
Okay, well, we have a whole bunch of written-in questions, so let me go ahead. And, Vinny, are you on the phone? Vinny?
Yep.
Okay, can you read the questions? That way people don't just have to hear my question.
Sure. So the next question from Sandra is, are property management fees an eligible NSP cost if applying a scattered site rental program?
Okay. So, Sandra, I think it depends upon what you mean by eligible NSP cost. If you mean property management pending disposition, right? So you're doing a scattered site rental project, and you're in the process of developing that project, or you're in the process of leasing up that project, and you haven't yet completed it. So you haven't yet completed those units. You haven't yet sold it to its end user or whatever. Then, yeah, those property management fees would be eligible as a disposition cost prior to when you've completed the project. But when you have completed the project and you're now, you've got it occupied and you're operating the project, then you can't use NSP funds for that ongoing payment of the property management fees. Now, if it's a subrecipient and they're getting the cash off the units, they're getting the cash flow off the units, you could have property management as one of the line item operating expenses, which would get deducted before you calculate program income. So you could pay it out of rent, basically, out of the income at the project, but you couldn't pay it as an NSP expense, not once the project is complete. David or Hunter, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no. That's a pretty clear explanation of it.
Okay, terrific. All right, who's next, Vinny?
Sure. So Bob asks, if you give the LH25 buyer a mortgage, is the P&I payment called program income?
Yes. So if you use NSP funds for that mortgage, whether it's a soft second or a second mortgage or a first mortgage, the program income, the money that comes back, assuming it's being paid back to either the grantee or to a subrecipient, because that's who's making the second mortgage or the first mortgage for that matter, the principal plus the interest that's coming back to the grantee or to the subrecipient is program income over time. Has folks anything to add to that one? Nope. Okay. We're good. Okay. All right. Vinny, who's next?
Sure. So Amanda asks, we have found that we are losing low-income buyers because of the cap we have on our soft second assistance. Would lifting that cap to meet the LH 25% open us up to possible fair housing complaints? We have turned down offers from buyers that needed assistance in excess of our cap.
It's a really good question, Amanda. I think you need to look at the demographics of who you have turned down and make sure there wasn't an unintended discriminatory effect, because surely that wasn't the reason why you turned down the loans. You turned them down because they were over your limit. But you'd want to make sure that there wasn't an unintended fair housing issue. And you might try talking to your local fair housing folks if you find that that's the case. But assuming that the demographics of the people whom you have turned down look like the demographics of the people whom you have funded, there's not some sort of difference between the funded people and the non-funded people, I think redesigning your program, which is really what you're talking about, offer a greater level of subsidy so that you can address the 25% set aside and get more people as home buyers. I don't think unto itself that program redesign would be a fair housing issue. But again, you might have had an unintended effect. So I would suggest checking it out. I don't know if you have a local fair housing person in your grantee. Talk to them, and if not, talk to your HUD fair housing. There's a fair housing person, I think, in almost every HUD field office, so you can run the demographics by them, and they could tell you. But the redesigning of the program itself is probably not a fair housing issue. It's the impact of having had that cap. I think one way that they might tell you might be able to mitigate that is by going back to those households whom you turned down because they needed too much subsidy and say, hey, we've now redesigned the program. We are now able to offer whatever amount of subsidy you're going to offer. Please reapply. So, there might be something like that. But, again, before you do that, do check it out with your local fair housing folks and just make sure you didn't have an unintended discriminatory effect by who got funded. Again, Hunter or David, any thoughts on that?
You're correct.
Okay. All right, great. Anybody else on the phone, Vinny? I'm sorry, on written in?
Not at this time, no.
Okay, and is there anybody else on the phone? Andrea?
No, there is not.
Okay, well, we'll give it a minute. So if folks have more questions, please feel free to write in, or please feel free to again, press *1 on your phone to ask an audio question.
Marcia?
Yes.
While we're waiting, I just want to point out to everyone that we're going to have a little bit of a webinar break here for the next week and a half for the holiday coming up. But on June 5th, we'll be having a Q&A session, and then that Thursday, June 7th, we'll be having the supportive housing webinar. So 2 really good webinars coming up.
Terrific. And as you said, some of them do tie into the topic we've been talking about, so I encourage folks to join in there. And also, we haven't talked about this, but if you do have a question that is more complicated than we're able to answer on this webinar, or if you have some scenario that you want to run past a TA provider, feel free to go into the Ask a Question function on the website, and you can send in a question, or you can go in and you can request technical assistance, and you can get remote TA to help you to rethink how you're doing your 25% set aside and maybe work through some of these questions or comments. So, Vinny, any other written-in questions?
We do have a question from Yolanda.
Okay.
An LH activity was budgeted for $3 million in DRGR.
Okay.
Later, state NSP funds of $150,000 were used on the same activity. NSP1 budget was then reduced by $150,000, leaving an NSP budget of $2,850,000, and an other fund/state NSP of $150,000. How much of the budget applies to LH25?
Okay, I'm just looking. I'm trying to work through the numbers here. Okay, so it sounds like what Yolanda is saying is we originally had pledged $3 million, but then we got $150 of state NSP funds, and so we reduced the $3 million by $150, making it $2,850, and then we had the $150 of state funds. And I assume that in this example, all of these units were LH25, so there's not some proration between this and non-LH25 units. If that is the case, then I think you could take credit for the entire $3 million, but it would be $2,850 for the local grantee, and it would be $150 for the state grantee. So you still have $3 million of NSP in this deal. The local grantee only gets credit for the $2,800, and the state gets credit for the $150 because that's where each of the money was drawn from. I believe that's the question. Hopefully I've answered it. Hopefully I've understood it. David or Hunter, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that because the funds the $3 million is made up of funds coming from different sources, if $3 million is the number that represented 25% of an allocation for one of those sources, then you haven't met or you haven't satisfied the requirement totally, right? Because you didn't use a full $3 million from your allocation. You only used a portion of it.
Right. So as an example, if you're the local grantee and $3 million was your minimum threshold, you're only going to get credit for the $2,850 that you actually spent on LH25 units. And again, I'm assuming that that was actually going to the LH25 units. You don't get credit for the full $3 million. So you've got $150,000 if you're the local grantee, and if $3 million was your minimum, that you have to go put into some other LH25 deal. That's what you're saying to be, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So you couldn't, I think what you're asking, Yolanda, is so that you could really double count the 150, and you really can't. So if there's only $3 million of NSP going in this deal, and 2850 is coming from the NSP1 grantee, then that's what they get credit for, and the state gets credit because the 150 is coming out of their grant. You can't double count the 150 because you didn't both release. So that may mean that the local grantee who originally set it up at $3 million is going to have to go back in and correct the RGR B2850. Okay. Any other questions written in? Any?
That's it for the moment.
Okay. And do we have anybody else on the phone? Andrea.
We do have Ebony on the phone line. Ebony, your line's open.
Hi, Ebony.
Yes. Hi, how are you guys?
Good.
I have a general question, and I missed the first part of the webinar, so excuse me if this has already been answered. But as far as the NSP1 and the 25% set aside, I understand that the program income that you receive back in also applies towards that. Now, the way our program is set up, I mean, we're moving properties, you know, and it's a moving target, I guess, to say. So I'm trying to gauge, you know, initially from our initial grant, we set aside 25%. So now we have program income that's been added to that. So with the timeline and that being a moving number constantly, I'm trying to figure out the best way to navigate that and then meeting the closeout of the grant.
Yeah, it is. You're right that it's going to be kind of a moving target because you can do your best guess of what you predict your program income is going to be, but you never know what a house is going to sell for, and you know, so it could move around a little bit. So I think I recommend a couple things. One is do your best guess of how much program income you're going to have, so that you can make a rough estimate of then how much of that is going to have to be a 25% set aside. So if you know that you have 50 more houses you're going to develop, and you think you're going to sell them for $100,000, you know, you can back into the math of about how much you're going to have to do, at least as a rough start. And then you're going to have to track that as you get program income coming in, and you may have to adjust, you know, depending upon if houses sell for more than you thought, and therefore you have more program income than you thought, for example. Secondly, you know, what I would recommend is try not to be just at exactly 25%, because, you know, you never know. You might have a deal that falls out or a house that sells to somebody you didn't think it was going to sell to, or, you know, whatever. I've been guiding the people I've been working with to build in a little cushion. You know, so go for 28% or 27% or something so that you have enough of a cushion in there that if program income is higher than you thought, or if a unit sells in a way you don't think it's going to, or the rental project, you know, one unit doesn't turn out the way you think it's going to, you have a little bit of a cushion built in there. But you are going to have to, the game you're talking about is sort of this tracking of TI as opposed to the tracking of the 25% set aside is real. And you're going to have to do it until you do get to close out.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help, Ebony?
Yeah, it's still moving. It's still a moving target. We'll just have to do the best that we can, and the same thing would apply, I guess, with NSP3 as well.
Yeah, it's the same exact thing. And what I would say is, you know, track it, and then as you get kind of closer to the expenditure deadline, and then you're getting closer to the closeout deadline, you know, do some points in time. You know, check at the end of the quarter or check at the end of the month or something, and just say, all right, we're now at 25.2%. We should be a little cautious, or we're at 28%, so we've got some cushion. So, you know, I would say just track it and periodically come back and tweak as you need to.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anybody else?
There are no further questions on the phone line.
Okay, one last call for written questions, any?
None.
Okay. All right, well, HUD, anything else to add before we conclude?
No, I don't think so. I hope everyone has a great Memorial Day weekend.
Definitely. All right, guys, well, have a wonderful holiday weekend, and thank you for joining this webinar. And again, please give us your feedback on whether this was helpful to you or not, and also let us know of any other kinds of webinars that you would find useful. So thanks, everybody, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Marsha.
And once again, ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's call. Thank you for your participation. Have a great day.